territory of New Mexico, 1888. At 6,000 feet on a windswept mesa, a Scandinavian-American freighter was still building his cabin in late September, while his neighbors had finished theirs weeks earlier. They called him a ruin squatter. They called him superstitious. While everyone else threw up 14 by 16-foot board and tar paper shacks for $28 in 3 weeks, he tucked his 14 by 18-foot timber cabin against the lee side of a collapsed adobe wall, 24 inches thick, 7 feet high, built by people whose names were already forgotten. His neighbors laughed at the man leaning a house on a heap of old mud. They built thin walls facing east for sunrise. He built his cabin facing south behind ancient stone, with a double-door vestibule and mud-lime chinking tight enough to cut air changes from 10 per hour to just 2. Then January's first blue norther hit the mesa. 40-mile-per-hour gusts, temperatures dropping from 42 degrees to 12 degrees in 6 hours. The board shacks leaked cold air through every seam. Families burned 8 to 10 cords of wood that winter, and still woke to interior temperatures in the 20s. But that fool's cabin behind the ruin? It stayed 15 to 20 degrees warmer on 25% less firewood, running interior nights in the mid-40s while his neighbors' children slept with frost forming on the walls 3 feet from their stoves. What did he understand about thermal mass, wind pressure, and the wisdom built into those ancient walls that made his excessive preparation the difference between comfort and suffering through a high-country winter? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The ruins had been there longer than anyone could remember. Pueblo builders, working generations before any European had seen this high mesa country, had laid up walls of sandstone and adobe that once sheltered families through countless winters. Now, in the autumn of 1888, those walls stood broken and weathered, rising 7 to 8 feet at their highest point along a stretch of 18 to 20 feet. The thick masonry faced south-southeast, positioned to catch winter sun, while the prevailing northwest winds carved around its massive bulk. Most settlers saw nothing but old mud and tumbled stone. The Scandinavian-American freighter, who had hauled goods between Las Vegas, New Mexico, and Santa Fe for the better part of a decade, saw something different. He saw thermal mass. He saw a windbreak. He saw shelter that had been tested by time and proven sound by the simple fact of its survival. His neighbors were building fast and building cheap. The standard approach across the territory was balloon framing, 1 by 12 boards nailed to a simple frame, wrapped in tar paper, and finished in 3 weeks for $28 to $30 in purchased materials. These shacks went up quick with wide-spaced nails, single doors facing east for the morning light, and minimal chinking between the boards. The builders figured winter was winter, and if you got cold, you burned more wood. Most families laid in 8 to 10 cords of split pinon and juniper to see them through the season. The freighter had learned different lessons during his years working alongside Hispano and Pueblo construction crews. He had watched them set vigas and latillas, mix adobe with the right clay content, and orient buildings to work with the sun rather than against it. He understood that mass absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, buffering the temperature swings that made high country winters so brutal. He knew that wind pressure against a building's walls forced cold air through every gap and crack, stealing heat faster than any stove could replace it. When he announced his intention to build in the lee of the ancient wall, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. The local storekeeper, who kept the settlement supplied with nails and lumber, called him a ruin squatter. The other homesteaders said he was superstitious, afraid of sleeping away from Indian stones that would bring him luck. They couldn't understand why any sensible man would tie his fate to a heap of old mud when he could put up a proper cabin on high ground where it would catch the sunrise and show for miles. The freighter began his foundation work in early September, choosing a site 2 to 3 inches away from the ancient masonry. This air gap would prevent moisture from wicking between old work and new, while still allowing his cabin to shelter in the ruin's wind shadow. He dug a rubble trench, 12 to 16 inches wide and 12 inches deep, filling it with washed stone to provide drainage and a stable base for his sill plates. Around the upslope perimeter, he cut a swale 6 to 8 inches deep with a 2% fall toward a natural draw. ensuring that snow melt and rain would flow away from his walls rather than pooling against the foundation. His cabin measured 14 by 18 feet, 252 square feet of living space, with plate height set at 7.5 feet. The frame was 2 by 4 studs spaced 24 inches on center rather than the 16-inch spacing common in town construction. This wider spacing reduced thermal bridging, the direct conduction of heat through the wooden frame members that could turn studs into cold strips inside the walls. 6 by 6 juniper sills rested on flat rock piers spaced 6 feet apart, supporting a floor deck of 1 by 8 planks over 2 by 6 joists. The roof followed a 5/12 pitch with 2 by 6 rafters spaced 24 inches on center. 1 by skip sheathing supported hand-split shakes, and the freighter extended the leeward eave 18 inches to protect his walls from wind-driven moisture. The stovepipe would exit near the ridge through a proper thimble fitted with a spark arrestor, essential equipment in country where a single ember could start a wildfire. But the feature that drew the most ridicule was his vestibule. While his neighbors cut single doors opening directly into their living spaces, the freighter built a 3 by 5 foot chamber with 2 doors, an outer door facing east and an inner door facing west. Never would both doors be open at the same time. This windlock would prevent the sudden temperature drops that plagued every other cabin each time someone stepped outside to fetch wood or check the weather. His single window measured 18 by 24 inches, positioned on the south wall to capture low winter sun. In contrast to his neighbor's large east-facing windows, this opening could be covered with oiled muslin during cold snaps and protected by a wooden shutter during storms. He cut no north-facing glass at all, understanding that northern exposures lost more heat than they gained even on the brightest winter days. The exterior walls received board and batten siding, but behind those boards went mud-lime chinking carefully worked into every gap between the frame members. Inside, he applied 1/2 to 3/4 inch clay dung plaster over the entire wall surface, then whitewashed it to reflect light and seal the surface. This interior mass would help buffer temperature swings, while the tight chinking would reduce air infiltration to 1 or 2 air changes per hour, a dramatic improvement over the 6 to 10 air changes his neighbors would experience during every windstorm. By late September, while the freighter was still applying his interior plaster, his neighbors were already burning their first fires and congratulating themselves on cabins completed ahead of schedule. They had invested their money in boards and nails rather than time and labor, following the frontier wisdom that speed mattered more than comfort. Winter was coming whether a man was ready or not, and a thin roof was better than no roof at all. But the freighter had calculated differently. His materials cost ran $22 to $28 for purchased lumber, nails, hinges, stovepipe, and glass. His labor stretched 10 to 12 days with 1 helper, plus 2 afternoons for plastering while sun and wind helped cure the clay mixture. He had cut and stacked 5.5 cords of pinon and juniper, split to wrist-thick billets 2 to 3 inches across for clean, hot burns. His neighbors were hauling 8 to 10 cords, planning to overwhelm winter's cold with sheer volume of fuel. The ancient wall rose beside his cabin like a massive buffer, 24 to 30 inches thick at its base and built to last. The people who had raised those walls understood this country in ways that went deeper than any homesteader's 3-year proving claim. They had learned to work with mass and wind rather than fighting them, and their knowledge was written in stone and adobe that had weathered centuries of high country winters. As October arrived and the first hard frosts began forming in the draws below the mesa, the freighter's neighbors continued their mockery. But soon enough winter would have the final word on whose approach had been sound and whose had been foolish. The question was not whether the cold would come, but who would be ready when it did. The ethics of the matter weighed on the freighter's mind as much as the engineering. These ruins represented the work of people who had called this mesa home when his own ancestors were still farming rocky fields in Norway. To tear stone from those walls or anchor his new construction directly into the ancient masonry would be theft, plain and simple. More than that, it would be foolish. The old builders had positioned their walls to work with forces he was only beginning to understand, and disturbing that alignment could destroy the very advantages he hoped to gain. The solution lay in partnership rather than plunder. By building in the lee of the ruin while maintaining that crucial 2 to 3 inch air gap, His cabin could shelter behind the massive windbreak without compromising the integrity of either structure. This standoff distance would prevent moisture from wicking between old adobe and new timber, while allowing the ancient thermal mass to moderate the temperature swings that made high-altitude winters so punishing. The site selection process had taken weeks of careful observation. The freighter walked the perimeter of the ruins at different times of day, noting how shadows fell and how wind patterns shifted with the weather. The south-southeast face of the wall captured the most winter sun, absorbing heat throughout the short days and radiating it back through the long nights. The northwest winds that dominated the winter weather pattern struck the opposite side of the mass, creating a pocket of relatively calm air where a building could rest without fighting constant pressure differentials. His foundation work began with that rubble trench, dug 12 to 16 inches wide and filled with washed stone that would drain freely while providing a stable base. The perimeter swale followed the natural contours of the site, maintaining a consistent 6 to 8 inch depth with enough fall to carry snowmelt in summer rains toward the draw below the mesa. Proper drainage would keep his sill plates dry and prevent the kind of rot that destroyed so many frontier buildings within a decade of construction. The floor system rested on 6x6 juniper sills placed on flat rock piers spaced 6 feet apart. These timbers had been cut from dead-standing trees and seasoned for 2 years, reducing the checking and shrinkage that plagued green lumber. The floor deck itself used 1x8 planks over 2x6 joists, spaced 16 inches on center, creating a platform that would remain stable through the seasonal movements that came with temperature and humidity changes. Wall construction followed principles the freighter had learned from Hispano builders during his freighting years. The 2x4 studs at 24-inch spacing reduced the number of thermal bridges while providing adequate structural support for the single-story building. Behind the board and batten exterior siding, he worked mud-lime chinking into every gap between frame members, using a mixture that would set hard but remain flexible enough to accommodate the slight movements that came with seasonal changes. The mud-lime recipe had come from an older mason who worked the villages along the Pecos River. 2 parts clay-rich soil, 1 part clean sand, enough water to achieve workability, and a handful of chopped straw for every bucket of mix. The lime came from burning limestone in a small kiln, then slaking it carefully with water to produce a putty that would carbonate slowly as it cured. This chinking would seal air leaks while allowing the wall system to breathe, preventing the moisture problems that plagued buildings sealed too tightly with modern materials. The interior plaster went on in 2 coats over the entire wall surface. The scratch coat used the same clay dung mixture that Pueblo builders had perfected over generations. 1 part clay soil, 1 part sand, enough chopped straw to bind the mixture, and fresh cow manure for plasticity and fiber. This base coat was scratched with a wooden comb to provide tooth for the finish coat, which used finer materials and less fiber to create a smooth surface that could be whitewashed. The roof structure followed a 5/12 pitch that would shed snow and rain while providing enough slope for proper drainage. 2x6 rafters spaced 24 inches on center supported 1x skip sheathing, over which the freighter laid hand-split cedar shakes. The 18-inch eave projection on the leeward side would protect his walls from wind-driven moisture, while the shorter windward eave would prevent uplift during storms. His stovepipe installation required particular care in this windy country. The penetration through the roof used a proper thimble with adequate clearance from combustible materials, and the stack extended high enough above the ridge to ensure proper draft even when gusts tried to create back pressure. A spark arrestor at the top would prevent the kind of wildfire that could consume thousands of acres of dry grass and timber in a matter of hours. The vestibule represented perhaps the most crucial innovation in the entire design. Most frontier cabins lost enormous amounts of heat every time someone opened the door, creating temperature drops of 6 to 8 degrees with each passage. The freighter's 3x5-foot windlock chamber featured 2 doors that could never both be opened simultaneously, an outer door facing east toward the main approach and an inner door facing west into the living space. The chamber itself was unheated, but it broke the direct connection between interior and exterior that made single-door systems so inefficient. Window placement followed solar principles rather than conventional preferences. While his neighbors cut large openings facing east to capture sunrise light, The freighter installed a single 18 by 24-inch window on the south wall to maximize winter heat gain. This opening could be covered with oiled muslin during severe weather and protected by a wooden shutter during storms. He cut no north-facing glass, understanding that northern exposures lost more heat than they gained even on the brightest days. The construction timeline stretched through October, with the freighter and his helper working steadily while neighbors completed their own projects weeks earlier. His materials cost ran slightly higher than the standard approach, $22 to $28 for purchased lumber, nails, hardware, and glass compared to the $18 to $22 his neighbors had invested. But his labor investment was paying for itself in quality and precision that would matter when winter tested every building on the mesa. His firewood preparation reflected the same attention to efficiency. While neighbors were hauling 8 to 10 cords of mixed wood, cutting whatever they could find and burning it green when necessary, the freighter had cut and split 5.5 cords of properly seasoned pinon and juniper. His billets measured 2 to 3 inches across, wrist-thick pieces that would burn hot and clean with minimal smoke production. Each stick had been split when the wood was green, then stacked with adequate air circulation to dry through the summer months. The ancient wall rose beside his work like a testament to the wisdom of builders who had understood this country in ways that went beyond any homesteader's brief acquaintance with the land. Those walls had been positioned to capture every available calorie of winter sun while deflecting the winds that could strip heat from any structure foolish enough to stand exposed on the mesa top. The freighter was building beside their work, not upon it, learning from their example without disturbing their achievement. As November approached and the first serious frosts began forming in the valleys below, the completed cabin stood ready for testing. The thick walls would moderate temperature swings, while the tight construction would prevent the kind of air infiltration that turned most frontier buildings into drafty shells when the wind began to blow. Soon enough, winter would reveal whether the freighter's methods could deliver the comfort and efficiency he had promised, or whether his neighbor's mockery had been justified all along. The morning of January 15, 1889, dawned clear and deceptively warm. By noon, the mercury thermometer nailed to the freighter's cabin wall read 42 degrees in the shade, and the ancient ruin wall absorbed winter sun like a massive heat sink. The surface temperature of the south-facing masonry climbed to 65 or 70 degrees, storing thermal energy that would matter more than anyone yet realized. In the board and tar paper shacks scattered across the mesa, families were enjoying what felt like an early taste of spring, with interior temperatures reaching 50 degrees by mid-afternoon. The territorial school teacher, maintaining her daily weather log as required by the county superintendent, noted the barometric pressure in her afternoon entry. The reading had been dropping steadily since dawn, and by 2 o'clock the mercury column showed clear signs of an approaching disturbance. Old-timers who had weathered decades of high country winters recognized the signs. A particular quality of light on the western horizon, the way livestock bunched together and sought shelter, and the uneasy stillness that preceded the most violent weather changes. By 4 o'clock, the first wisps of high cirrus clouds were streaming in from the northwest, and the temperature began its precipitous fall. Within 2 hours, the mercury had dropped 30 degrees, and the wind began to rise with the characteristic howl that gave blue northers their name. These were the storms that separated survivors from casualties on the high plains, violent cold fronts that could drive temperatures down 50 degrees in a matter of hours, while generating winds that turned any exposed structure into a battleground. The freighter had been splitting wood when the first gusts hit, and he quickly secured his tools and checked his cabin's storm preparations. His stovepipe damper was set for a clean, steady burn, and his firebox held a charge of seasoned pinon billets that would provide hours of consistent heat without the temperature swings that came from burning green or poorly sized wood. The vestibule door latches were checked, and the interior temperature was holding at 58 degrees as the storm gathered force outside. Across the mesa, his neighbors were scrambling to prepare their own shelters for the onslaught. The storekeeper who had mocked the ruined squatter was stuffing rags into the worst gaps in his board and batten siding, but with nail spacing of 8 to 10 inches and minimal chinking, his shack had never been designed to resist the kind of pressure differentials that a 40-mile-per-hour wind could generate. Every gap between the boards became a pathway for cold air infiltration, and no amount of fuel seemed adequate to replace the heat that the wind was stealing. By 7 o'clock that evening, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and the wind was gusting to 50 miles per hour across the exposed mesa top. The difference between the two building approaches became starkly apparent as families settled in for what promised to be a brutal night. The freighter's cabin, sheltered behind the massive ruin wall, was experiencing perhaps half the wind pressure of the exposed shacks, and his interior temperature was holding at 52 degrees on a single charge of the firebox, roughly 8 to 10 pounds of properly seasoned wood. In the storekeeper's shack, the same period required 15 to 18 pounds of fuel to maintain an interior temperature that never climbed above 40 degrees. The pressure differential created by the wind was forcing cold air through every gap in his walls faster than his stove could compensate, creating a losing battle that would only worsen as the night progressed and fuel supplies dwindled. His family could feel the drafts as physical sensations, cold streams of air that found every gap in their clothing and made comfortable sleep impossible. The territorial school teacher, bundled in her bed with heated bricks wrapped in towels, was recording temperature readings every few hours as part of her weather documentation. Her thermometer showed the outdoor temperature continuing to drop throughout the night, reaching 5 degrees below zero by midnight, with gusts that rattled every structure on the mesa. But the indoor readings told a more complex story, one that would reshape every conversation about building design once the storm passed. The freighter's cabin, with its tight construction and massive windbreak, was maintaining an interior temperature of 46 to 48 degrees through the worst hours of the storm. His air infiltration rate, carefully controlled through proper chinking and vestibule design, was running at approximately 1.5 air changes per hour, enough for adequate ventilation without the massive heat losses that plagued less carefully built structures. Each time he needed to step outside for firewood or other necessities, the vestibule limited his temperature loss to 2 or 3 degrees rather than the 6 to 8 degree drops his neighbors experienced with every door opening. The storekeeper's family was fighting a different battle entirely. Despite burning fuel at nearly twice the rate of the freighter's household, their interior temperature had dropped to the high 20s by midnight, and frost was forming on the interior walls 3 feet from their stove. The air infiltration rate in their shack was running between 8 and 10 air changes per hour during the heaviest gusts, creating a convective system that turned their living space into little more than a poorly insulated tent. The physical mechanisms at work were brutally simple. Wind pressure against the windward walls of exposed buildings created positive pressure that forced air through every available gap. Meanwhile, the leeward walls experienced negative pressure that sucked interior air out through gaps on that side. Buildings caught in these pressure differentials became inadvertent ventilation systems, exchanging heated interior air for frigid exterior air at rates that no heating system could overcome. The freighter's cabin, sheltered behind 24 to 30 inches of stone and adobe mass, experienced dramatically reduced pressure differentials. The ancient wall absorbed and deflected much of the wind energy before it could reach the newer structure, while the thermal mass continued to release stored heat from the previous day's solar gain. The result was a microclimate that moderated both wind exposure and temperature swings in ways that purely technical solutions could not achieve. By dawn, the temperature had stabilized at 8 degrees below zero, but the wind was beginning to subside from its peak fury. The damage assessment would take days to complete, but the immediate contrasts were already apparent to anyone willing to venture outside and compare conditions between different approaches to frontier shelter. The storekeeper's family had burned through nearly half a cord of wood during the single night, and they had still awakened to interior temperatures in the mid-20s with ice forming in their water buckets. Their fuel consumption rate during the peak storm hours had reached levels that would exhaust their winter supply weeks before spring if such conditions persisted. More troubling still, 2 family members were showing early signs of frostnip on fingers and toes, despite their best efforts to stay warm throughout the night. The freighter's household had used approximately 1/20th of a cord during the same period while maintaining interior temperatures that never dropped below 44 degrees. His fuel efficiency was running nearly twice as high as his neighbors, and his family had slept comfortably enough that normal daily activities could continue without the desperate focus on survival that characterized so many frontier winters. But the storm was only beginning to tell its full story. 7 more days of brutal cold lay ahead, and the contrast between building approaches would become even more stark as fuel supplies dwindled and the cumulative effects of inadequate shelter began to take their toll on families who had trusted in speed and economy rather than thermal performance and wind resistance. The cold held for 7 more days, testing every structure and every family's preparation in ways that would be remembered for decades. Each morning brought new evidence of the fundamental differences between building approaches, measured not in abstract theories, but in cordwood consumed, interior temperatures maintained, and the physical toll on families trying to survive a high country winter in inadequate shelter. The territorial school teacher maintained her meticulous records throughout the ordeal, noting not only temperature and weather conditions, but also attendance patterns that revealed which families were managing the crisis and which were struggling simply to survive. The children from the ruin-sheltered cabin attended every day of the cold spell, arriving with warm hands and adequate clothing. The storekeeper's children missed 4 of the 7 days, and when they did appear, their teacher documented signs of cold exposure that spoke to conditions inside their family's shelter. By the 3rd day of the cold spell, the storekeeper was rationing his firewood with the grim calculation of a man who could see his winter supply disappearing weeks ahead of schedule. His shack was consuming 3/4 of a cord per week during the sustained cold, burning through fuel at rates that would exhaust his 8-cord supply before March if the winter proved typical. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple: either find ways to reduce consumption or face the choice between freezing and abandoning the claim entirely. The freighter's cabin was telling a different story. His fuel consumption during the same period ran just over half a cord, achieving interior temperatures that averaged 15 to 20 degrees warmer than his neighbors while using 40% less wood. The thermal mass of the ancient wall continued to moderate temperature swings throughout each day, absorbing what heat it could from the weak winter sun and releasing it slowly through the long nights. Even when clouds blocked direct solar gain for days at a time, the massive masonry provided thermal stability that purely frame construction could never match. The blacksmith who maintained stovepipes and heating equipment for the scattered homesteads was making emergency calls to families whose systems were failing under the extreme conditions. The storekeeper's stovepipe was backpuffing whenever wind gusts stalled the natural draft, filling the interior with smoke and forcing the family to choose between adequate heat and breathable air. Nail pops were opening gaps every 8 to 10 inches along his board and batten siding, creating new pathways for cold air infiltration with each temperature cycle. More troubling were the signs of cold injury beginning to appear among families in the least adequate shelters. The storekeeper's wife was showing the telltale signs of mild frost nip on her fingertips, the result of nights spent in interior temperatures that never climbed above the low 30s despite continuous firing of their stove. His youngest child had developed a persistent cough that spoke to sleeping in air cold enough to stress respiratory systems already challenged by high altitude and dry conditions. The freighter's family showed no such symptoms. Their interior temperatures during the coldest nights never dropped below 44 degrees, and daytime conditions inside the cabin remained comfortable enough for normal activities. His children could complete schoolwork by lamplight without gloves, and his wife could tend cooking and household tasks without the constant struggle against cold that characterized so many frontier homes during severe weather. The piñon and juniper woodcutter, who supplied fuel to most families on the mesa, was tracking consumption, patterns with the eye of a man whose business depended on understanding his customers' needs. His records showed the freighter purchasing 5.5 cords in the fall and using it at rates that would last through even an extended winter. Meanwhile, families in standard construction were burning through their 8 to 10 cord supplies at rates that would require emergency deliveries if the cold persisted into March. The physical evidence was mounting with each passing day. Interior frost formations in the standard shacks extended 3 to 4 feet from exterior walls, creating zones where water froze solid despite the presence of heated stoves. The freighter's cabin showed no such frost patterns, maintaining above-freezing conditions throughout the interior even during the coldest nights. His windows remained clear while his neighbors scraped ice from interior glass surfaces each morning. The difference in door operation became another telling measure of performance. Standard cabins lost 6 to 8 degrees of interior temperature with each passage through their single doors, requiring constant attention to minimize trips outside for fuel, water, or necessities. The freighter's vestibule system limited temperature drops to 2 or 3 degrees per passage, allowing normal household operations to continue without the desperate conservation measures that characterized less well-designed shelters. By the end of the week-long cold spell, the cumulative effects were impossible to ignore. The freighter had burned approximately 3/10 of a cord while maintaining interior conditions that supported normal daily life. His neighbors had consumed between 6/10 and 7/10 of a cord while achieving interior temperatures that made sleep difficult and normal activities nearly impossible. The fuel savings alone represented weeks of cutting and splitting labor, but the real advantage lay in the quality of life that proper design could provide, even under extreme conditions. The storekeeper, swallowing his pride along with the bitter medicine of proven failure, approached the freighter on the 8th day as temperatures finally began to moderate. His request was simple and direct. He wanted to understand how thermal mass, wind protection, and controlled ventilation could achieve the results he had witnessed. His own family's survival through the remainder of the winter might depend on modifications to their existing shelter or construction of something entirely different. The freighter's response revealed the generosity that often characterized frontier communities, despite their surface skepticism and mockery. Rather than gloating over his vindication, he offered to share the principles he had learned from Hispano and Pueblo builders during his freighting years. The lesson would be practical and specific, focused on techniques that could be applied to existing structures or incorporated into new construction using locally available materials and traditional methods. The demonstration he proposed would use simple tools and materials to illustrate the fundamental principles of thermal mass, air infiltration control, and wind pressure management. A candle flame, 2 wooden boxes with different air gap patterns, and a sun-warmed adobe brick would serve to show how buildings could work with natural forces rather than fighting them. The concepts were ancient, proven by generations of builders who had learned to survive in harsh climates using nothing more than careful observation, traditional materials, and construction methods refined through centuries of trial and success. The demonstration took place on a calm February afternoon when the sun had enough strength to warm the ancient wall and the wind had dropped to levels that allowed comfortable conversation outdoors. The freighter had prepared his teaching materials with the same care he brought to construction work. 2 wooden boxes of identical size, one with gaps deliberately cut between the boards and another with tight joints sealed with mud-lime chinking. A single candle would provide the heat source, while a sun-warmed adobe brick would illustrate the principles of thermal mass that most frontier builders had never considered. Word of the lesson had spread quietly through the small community, and by the appointed time, 7 families had gathered near the ruins to witness what the storekeeper was calling his education in staying warm. The territorial schoolteacher brought her notebook, recognizing that she was about to observe the kind of practical knowledge that deserved documentation for future settlers who might face similar challenges. The blacksmith came with his tool bag, already planning modifications to existing structures based on whatever principles emerged from the demonstration. The freighter began with the simplest concept, using the candle and 2 boxes to show how air infiltration affected heating efficiency. The gapped box, representing standard frontier construction, allowed the candle flame to flicker and dance as air moved freely through the openings. He could maintain the interior temperature only by burning the candle at full height, consuming wax at rates that quickly became unsustainable. The sealed box required much less flame to achieve the same interior temperature, and the heat remained stable even when exterior conditions changed. The lesson was immediately applicable to every structure on the mesa. Standard board and batten construction with wide nail spacing and minimal chinking allowed air infiltration rates of 6 to 10 air changes per hour during windy conditions. The freighter's cabin achieved controlled ventilation of 1 to 2 air changes per hour through careful sealing and the use of his vestibule system. The difference represented the margin between comfort and misery during extended cold spells. The thermal mass demonstration required more explanation, but the principles became clear. Once families could feel the warmth radiating from the sun-heated brick, The freighter placed the brick near the sealed box and showed how it continued to provide heat for hours after being removed from direct sunlight. The ancient wall behind his cabin worked on the same principle, but at a scale that could moderate temperature swings throughout entire buildings. 24 to 30 inches of stone and adobe could absorb heat throughout short winter days and release it slowly through long winter nights, buffering the extreme temperature swings that made high-altitude living so challenging. The widowed rancher with 2 children was the first to request specific guidance for modifying her existing shelter. Her board wickiup had been adapted into a functional shack, but the recent cold spell had revealed its fundamental inadequacies. The freighter walked the perimeter of her structure, noting the prevailing wind patterns and the southern exposure that could be enhanced with proper thermal mass placement. His recommendation was straightforward: build a freestanding half wall of dry laid stone, 16 to 24 inches thick and 5 to 6 feet high along the south-southeast side of her shack, maintaining a 2-inch gap to prevent moisture problems. The construction could be accomplished using stone gathered from the mesa itself, requiring no purchased materials beyond the time and labor needed to lay up the wall. The thermal benefit would begin immediately, as the mass absorbed solar energy during the day and radiated it back toward the building through the night. Combined with improved chinking using mud-lime mixture and the addition of a simple vestibule, the modifications could reduce fuel consumption by 25 to 40% while improving interior comfort dramatically. The blacksmith focused on air sealing techniques that could be applied to existing structures without major reconstruction. His experience with nail pops and back-puffing stovepipes had taught him that most frontier buildings failed not because of inadequate heating, but because of excessive heat loss through uncontrolled air infiltration. The freighter's chinking methods could be retrofitted to existing walls by working mud-lime mixture into gaps from the interior side, then covering the sealed areas with whitewashed clay plaster for durability and appearance. Edge nail spacing represented another simple modification with significant impact. Standard construction used nails every 8 to 10 inches along board edges, allowing wind to lift and separate the siding during storms. Tightening the spacing to 6 inches and using slightly larger nails could eliminate most of the air gaps that open during high wind events. The additional hardware cost would be minimal compared to the fuel savings achieved through reduced infiltration. The storekeeper was taking careful notes on modifications that could be marketed to his customers, recognizing that the recent cold spell had created demand for building improvements among families who had experienced the inadequacies of standard construction. His own family's struggle with interior temperatures in the 20s, despite continuous firing, had convinced him that speed and economy meant nothing if the resulting structures could not maintain livable conditions during normal winter weather. Vestibule construction emerged as the most popular modification because it could be added to existing structures with minimal disruption and immediate results. The freighter's 3x5-foot windlock had reduced temperature drops from 6 to 8 degrees per door, opening down to 2 to 3 degrees, allowing normal household operations to continue without the desperate fuel conservation that characterized poorly designed entries. The construction required basic carpentry skills and materials that were readily available, framing lumber, hinges, and enough boards to create walls and a roof for the small chamber. The territorial school teacher documented attendance patterns that validated the building modifications being discussed. Families who had implemented even simple improvements showed fewer absences during subsequent cold snaps, and the children arrived at school with better clothing and fewer signs of cold exposure. The correlation between adequate shelter and educational outcomes was becoming clear to anyone willing to examine the evidence systematically. By spring, the modifications had spread across the Mesa community in patterns that reflected both the urgency of winter survival and the practical wisdom of traditional building methods. 5 families had constructed thermal mass walls using local stone, 3 had added vestibules to their existing structures, and virtually every household had improved their chinking using the mud-lime techniques the freighter had demonstrated. The average firewood consumption dropped from 8 to 10 cords per season down to 5 to 7 cords, representing savings in both labor and fuel costs that freed families to pursue other necessary tasks. The freighter had become the community's informal building consultant, advising on modifications that could improve existing structures and design principles for new construction. His original status as a ruined squatter had evolved into recognition as someone who understood principles that went deeper than the conventional wisdom of frontier building. The ancient wall that had sheltered his cabin continued to stand as testimony to builders who had solved similar problems generations earlier, using techniques that remained valid for anyone willing to learn from traditional knowledge rather than dismissing it as primitive superstition.